Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Liturgy of the Chalice. Today we continue our discussions of the Gospel of Mark. This is part 21 of a series. So now, Jesus has already entered into Jerusalem. He's given some private teachings and points of advice to his disciples. And now he's re-entering Jerusalem, and he begins to address some of his detractors. Some of those people that are opposed to both Mar Yeshua, the Master Jesus, and to his teachings, because some of his teachings are in opposition to what the priesthood in the Second Temple in Jerusalem were teaching. So Jesus tongue-ties his detractors. He's shown as being a masterful teacher and also somebody that's very good at deflecting negativity and possible violence. So he's very good at extinguishing situations with his wisdom and his tongue-in-cheek remarks. So in Mark 11, 27 through 33, it says, again, they came to Jerusalem, that is Jesus and his disciples and his entourage that might be following around him to help support his mission. As he, Jesus, was walking in the temple, the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders came to him and said, "By what authority are you doing these things? Who gave you this authority to do them?" Jesus said to them, "I will ask you one question. Answer me, and I will tell you by what authority I do these things. Did the baptism of John come from heaven, or was it of human origin? Answer me." They argued with one another. "If we say from heaven, he will say, 'Why then did you not believe him?' But shall we say of human origin?" They were afraid of the crowd, for all regarded John as truly a prophet. So they answered Jesus, "We do not know." And Jesus said to them, "Neither will I tell you by what authority I am doing these things." So Jesus, the Master Jesus, was extremely clever in this, because you have to understand that Jesus was teaching a renewed covenant with God, a renewed agreement with God. If you do this halakha for purifying your heart, for purifying your mind, then you'll be eligible to be reborn into this communion of saints, the Baranash, the collective Messiah of anointed saints that Jesus headed. Jesus taught that you could do things independently. Yes, it's nice to have a group of people, a church to go to. It's good to have somebody wise, possibly wiser than you, teaching you some things that possibly you didn't know, that edifies your spiritual understanding. But for the most part, the spiritual path is very solitary. You have to actually do the work. You have to do the spiritual study. You have to do the worship with me here on Sundays. You have to pray. You have to meditate. You have to contemplate. There's a lot of doing. And it is in the doing that you get the spiritual fruit. John the Baptist, as many prophets before him, he felt that some people had fallen away from the way of God, as described in Torah. So he said, let's do this mikvah. A mikvah is a baptism, a water purification rite. And he would dip people in the Jordan or other bodies of living water. And this would be a cleansing. And he'd say, now you need to make an effort to do the way of God, to make teshuvah, to return to God by doing what is described in Torah. Although Jesus didn't agree with everything that John the Baptist taught, and we can't really get into that today, but we've talked about it in prior classes you can find on YouTube, and we'll talk about it in the future once those occasions arise during the liturgy of the Chalice. But Jesus did believe that people had fallen away from the God. And he didn't believe that only the people, the Am Haaretz, the people of the land of Israel, he didn't believe just the people fell away from the way of God. He believed the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders are the priests of the Second Temple in Jerusalem, he felt they had fallen away from the path of God. And Jesus, self-identified as a prophet of God, he's coming to give a message, not only to the lay people of the land, but he's coming with a message for the priesthood of the Second Temple. And the priesthood really wasn't about teaching people to do the way of God. They said, give me a little bit of money, I'll do a sacrifice in the altar, and then your sins will go away. They offered this easy path. Much like modern Christian orthodoxy says, just believe in Jesus. And you can basically do whatever you want. We'll forgive you. He'll forgive you. Just believe in him and you're saved. It's the same thing. It's made up. It's not based in Judaism, and Jesus was a Jewish sage. So Jesus was saying, this priesthood has fallen away. And the priesthood was very powerful. The Second Temple was very powerful. They are very linked to the Herodian monarchy, because the Herodian monarchy built the Second Temple. The priesthood felt they had the authority of God to do what they were doing, to teach what they were teaching. So they asked Jesus, when he was causing all this commotion, turning over tables in the temple, talking to people, making them question the ancient traditions, or the traditions that the temple is currently preaching and teaching. They said, by what authority are you doing these things? By whose authority are you teaching differently from us? Doing differently from us? Healing people? Exorcising unclean spirits from various people? Who gave you this authority to do this stuff? And Jesus knew that if he said, God gave me this authority, my Abba, my Father, Mother, God gave me this authority to teach, to heal, to exorcise, to guide humanity. He knew he'd be arrested right there and be charged with blasphemy. Jesus was trying to avoid arrest and execution for as long as he could, so that those that had ears to hear and eyes to see could choose his way, could choose his halakha, his walk, his interpretation on how to fulfill Torah, to purify the heart and the mind, to be spiritually reborn from the old Adam to the second Adam, which is the Bar Anash, the Son of Mankind, collective Messiah, or communion of saints. He knew if he said, I am inspired by God and God gives me the authority to do this, that he would be arrested and murdered right then, and less people would hear his message. Jesus knew it didn't take a mystic to understand that going against the authorities of the temple and against the Herodian government He knew this would get him arrested and killed. But in stories such as these, he was buying time so that he could be amongst true seekers. So they're trying to bait Jesus. They're trying to bait him into saying, God gives me authority, so they could arrest him and kill him. And Jesus was very clever. He said, I'll answer your question if you answer mine. He turned the tables on them, and it was quite brilliant. He said, did the baptism of John come from heaven, or was it of human origin? Answer me. All the prophets, almost exclusively, were anti-temple establishment. They all taught that you have to do something within yourself, separate from the priesthood, in order to attain the Olam Haba, the world to come, heaven. And the temple establishment was very much against John the Baptist. And eventually the builder of the second temple, King Herod, beheaded John because he had become so powerful and so popular with the people that he was afraid John would take over. It was the same reason why Jesus was crucified. The temple establishment was afraid that people would listen to Jesus and not them. So they talked into the ear of the King Herod, and they talked into the ear of Pontius Pilate, and they said, he's saying he's going to be the king. He thinks he's better than the Caesar, than the emperor, the Roman emperor. And the Roman government basically executed Jesus for sedition, for a planned insurrection against the Roman governance. But needless to say, John was exceptionally popular with the Jewish people. And they believed John's message came from heaven, from God. But the priesthood and the second temple establishment would never admit that because John was teaching something very different than they were. So, if the priesthood, the Jewish priesthood of the second temple, if they admitted that John's teachings came from heaven, they'd be saying that God gave him the authority to say something different than we say. So they couldn't admit to that because that would make them wrong. And if they said that John's teachings were of human origin, they would cause an uprising of the people, which is the last thing they wanted to happen. Because the people believed John, his message was divine. So they were stuck. They couldn't answer the question for fear of retribution. Just like Jesus could not answer by whose authority he does these things because of immediate retribution that would happen. Jesus checkmated them. He checked their trickery with his own unanswerable question to the temple establishment. So they said, we don't know. Because either way they went, if they said that John's teachings came from heaven, that meant that they were wrong in oppressing John. And if they said that John's teachings came from just human imagination, he just made it up, then they were afraid that the crowd would become a mob. And if the crowd became a mob, then you're going to have the whole Roman military come in to squash an uprising, because they wanted to keep everybody under their thumb, under their control. So Jesus very cleverly stopped violence from happening, and he stopped his arrest and execution from happening for now. by invoking the name of his spiritual master, John the Baptist, seen here to the left. And then Jesus teaches these hearers, the temple establishment, all these priests that had come to trick him. He began teaching a parable. And this was him criticizing them. But again, it was very clever because he taught it in the form of a teaching story. He didn't directly say, you guys are doing the wrong thing and you're going to get punished and your way of being is going to be destroyed forever. He didn't say that. But it was encapsulated in a story and they caught on to the fact that this story was in fact about them. So again, Jesus rebuked them, but in a very clever way, so that he wouldn't be instantly arrested and executed. So Mark 12, 1 through 12, the parable of the vineyard. Pardon me. A man planted a vineyard, put a fence around it, dug a pit for the winepress, and built a watchtower. Then he leased it to tenants and went to another country. When the season came, he sent a slave to the tenants to collect from them his share of the produce of the vineyard. But they seized him and beat him and sent him away empty-handed. And again, he sent another slave to them. This one they beat over the head and insulted. Then he sent another, and that one they killed. And so it was with many others. Some they beat, and others they killed. He had still one other, a beloved son. Finally, he sent him to them, saying, they will respect my son. But those tenants said to one another, this is the heir. Come, let us kill him, and the inheritance will be ours. So they seized him, killed him, and threw him out of the vineyard. What then will the owner of the vineyard do? He will come and destroy the tenants and give the vineyard to others. Have you not read this scripture? The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. This was the Lord's doing, and it is amazing in our eyes. When they, the temple establishment, realized that he, Jesus, had told this parable against them, they wanted to arrest him, but they feared the crowd, so they left him and went away. This story, this parable, is probably mostly historical, although it's often interpreted in anti-Semitic ways. I'll give my thoughts on this parable, and I encourage you to think on your own and make decisions for yourselves. A man planted a vineyard. A man is God. The man, the owner of the vineyard, is God. The vineyard is Israel. He put a fence around it, dug a pit for the winepress, and built a watchtower. So God protects Jerusalem by putting a fence around it. He protects Israel by putting a fence around it. He dug a pit for the winepress. You apply pressure to grapes to create the final product of wine. So in this vineyard in Israel, the place where people struggle with God to find perfection, God applies pressure to the grapes, to his children, to turn them into wine that produces within itself divine inebriation, divine drunkenness, divine ecstasy of the Olam Haba, the spiritual world to come. And God built a watchtower because he watches over Jerusalem. He's omniscient, he's omnipresent. He sees and hears all. Then he leased it to the tenants. The tenants is the Jewish priesthood of the temple, of the second temple, and he went to another country. Although God is spiritually immanent in every molecule of space, we don't see God. So there's this idea of the absence of God. Even though God indwells in every heart and in every molecule of space, we don't see God in a physical form. God is not anthropomorphic. God is pure consciousness. God is pure goodness. So he went to another country signifies the apparent absence of God for those that do not have any inward spiritual experience. When the season came, he sent a slave to the tenants. God sent a prophet to the Jewish temple establishment because he wanted to collect from them his share of produce that they produced. So God sends a prophet to the temple priesthood to collect souls, that their teachings had produced perfected souls, and he wanted to collect or bring into himself, bring into heaven, bring into spiritual awareness, bring into the communion of saints, perfected souls that were perfected from the priesthood's teachings. But they, the temple establishment, seized the prophet, beat him, and killed him. And this repeats several times. God sends another slave, and another slave, and another slave. And each one is beaten and killed and destroyed by the temple establishment, the Jewish priesthood, the so-called tenants of this parable. But God still had one other, a beloved son. Jesus is speaking of himself. Finally, he sent him to them and said, and he thought to himself, God thought to himself, they will respect this prophet, my son. Because every Jewish saint was called a son of God. It didn't mean that God inseminated the prophet's mother. But a son of God was an epithet, a title of honor given to a Jewish saint or a daughter of God. So they will respect this sage, this son of God that I'm sending to them. But those tenants, the Jewish priesthood, said to one another, this is the true heir of God, of God's authentic teachings, which are different from mine, from ours. Come, let's kill him, and the inheritance will be ours. So here, in the next verse, Jesus predicts his death. So they, the temple priesthood, seized him, Jesus, killed him, Jesus, and threw him, by means of execution, out of the vineyard, out of Jerusalem, out of Israel at large. What then will the owner of the vineyard do? He will come and destroy the tenants and give the vineyard to others. We have to be very careful with this underlined phrase. What then will the owner of the vineyard do? He will come and destroy the tenants and give the vineyard to others. It's historically true, but we should not interpret it in an anti-Semitic way. That's exceptionally important. Later on in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus predicts the destruction of the second temple 40 years before it happened. And Jesus is also predicting that right here. He's telling the Jewish temple establishment, the priesthood that ran the second temple, they're literally standing in front of him, listening to him. And he says, because you, the Jewish priesthood, have abused, hurt, beat, killed, murdered, beheaded the prophets that God has sent you, What will the owner of the vineyard do? What will God do? He will come and destroy the tenants, the Jewish priesthood, and give the vineyard to others. Give Jerusalem, Israel, to others. And this did come true. In 70 AD, the Roman Empire destroyed Jerusalem and leveled the second temple. So essentially, Jesus is saying that God allowed the Roman Empire to destroy the second temple. And when the second temple was destroyed, the Sadducees disappeared. They ran the second temple. They don't exist anymore. And the priesthood of the second temple disappeared. He will give the vineyard to others. He did. The Jewish temple priesthood disappeared. There is no temple priesthood anymore. The closest thing to a Jewish priesthood is what lives through apostolic succession, meaning priests, deacons, and bishops of Christianity, of Christian sects. But still, that priesthood is of the order of Melchizedek, who only offers bread and wine at the altar in the book of Genesis. It's never been a sacrificing animals and burning and spilling blood and such like that to appease a God who's thirsty for blood retribution against sins. It's never been that. But the only style of Jewish priesthood that exists to this day comes from Jesus, who himself, through his biological lineage, he inherited priesthood. And through that, he was able to give the priesthood pass a form of Jewish priesthood down through history that comes to me and other bishops, and we share those gifts with anybody who wants to become a deacon, deaconess, priest, or priestess. So God destroyed the second temple, or allowed it to become destroyed, and it also destroyed the Jewish priesthood as it existed. So Judaism became a religion of the book. After 70 AD, when the temple was destroyed, the priesthood was never revived to this day, although some sects are interested in doing it. Some Jewish sects, not all, are interested in building a third temple. Whether that will come to pass or not, we'll have to wait and see. And Jesus was not against the priesthood sacrificing animals like some people might think. He was against the way they taught, that he felt that their interpretation of Torah was man-made, and that it made it difficult or impossible for people to become spiritually perfected and to enter heaven, the Olam Haba. So he was against their methods, not against their worship in the temple. He was against the way they taught, and that their teachings benefited themselves by giving them a position of power, and benefited their coffers by filling it with money. He felt that they were self-righteous, that they looked down their noses at the people, that they used the people instead of freeing and liberating the people. So Jesus saw himself as a spiritual liberator. I'm taking the power away from this rotting priesthood, and I'm giving it back to the people. And it's unfortunate that modern Christian orthodoxy does very similar things. They twist his probable historical teachings, so it gives power to a priesthood or to ministers and makes them the arbiters of truth rather than God. Then the Catholic Church, the Vatican, becomes very, very rich, And you see all the ministers of these mega churches driving around in Rolls Royces and having 10 mansions, which is ridiculous. They're only empowering and enriching themselves. Jesus wanted to empower and enrich the people that followed him by helping them to become spiritually perfected by doing the way of God, doing the Torah as taught and interpreted in his halakha, in his teachings. So God did destroy the second temple effectively, because nothing happens without God's will. He did destroy the temple priesthood. In the vineyard, Israel was given to others. It was given to rabbinical Judaism, because they developed a religion of the book in the synagogues, and rabbis began to exist. The rabbinical tradition began. And of course, the other tradition is what became Christianity. So, no, Christianity did not supplant Judaism. That's anti-Semitic and it's incorrect. Christianity, properly understood from the probable historical teachings of Jesus, would actually be a reformed sect of Judaic thought, of Judaism. So really, historically speaking, without the dogmas of an orthodoxy or modern Christianity, God destroyed the second temple and the priesthood and gave it to Palestinian Christianity, which was run by James the Just after Jesus' death. James was Jesus' biological brother. That was one sect of many that proliferated from the teachings of Jesus in the vineyard, in and around Jerusalem. And then, of course, after 70 AD, rabbinical Judaism, the religion of the book, arose, and it's been evolving ever since. So, a form of corrupted Judaism, the temple worship in the second temple, was exterminated by God because they rejected and murdered his prophets, who were sent to do course corrections for them. And after God tried sending prophets many times, and they were destroyed, and Jesus predicted that they would destroy him too, what's God left to do? He's just going to destroy those that cannot hear his message, those that will not give his true message to the people. The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. This was the Lord's doing, and it is amazing in our eyes. Of course, this is interpreted as being Jesus. Jesus is the cornerstone, the keystone of the church that the builders, the Jews en masse, rejected. But that stone has now been placed firmly in the church. So this is often interpreted as the message and the teachings of the Jews being rejected in favor of Jesus and Christianity. I don't believe that's the true interpretation. If Jesus did quote this from Psalms, he didn't mean it that way. We have to always remember that Jesus was a Jew and that he taught a form of reformed Judaism. And he perpetuated a priesthood that stems back to Melchizedek, who didn't offer animal sacrifice, but he offered bread and wine in a form of Seder. A Seder is a sacred Jewish meal that ultimately became reinterpreted by Paul as the Lord's Supper or the Eucharist. The stone that the builders rejected was the prophetic teachings of the prophets. Jesus considered himself a prophet. But now prophetic teaching has become the cornerstone. and the blood atonement of the priesthood in the second temple has been destroyed by God. When they, the temple establishment, realized that he, Jesus, had told this parable against them, they wanted to arrest him right there on the spot. But they were afraid, because remember, when Jesus came into Jerusalem, people were lining up in the streets, putting their cloaks in the street, laying down palms to create a red carpet for him to come in. The people loved Jesus' authentic spiritual magnetism. They loved him, just like they loved John the Baptist before he was beheaded by King Herod. So they didn't arrest him because they were afraid of a riot. They were afraid that people would revolt against them. So it wasn't the right time for them to arrest him, try him, and murder him. So they waited for a different opportunity. And then another instance in Jerusalem, they tried to get Jesus arrested by the Roman governor, right? This was a ploy for him to speak against the emperor. You have to remember that the emperor thought himself divine. Julius Caesar and all the other Roman emperors, they thought they were divine. They thought they were gods, or at least that they were empowered by God or filled with God's divine authority on earth. So they were very puffed up. And the Romans at this time were occupying Jerusalem and Israel. They were the latest authoritarian government to come in and take over the Jews. So in Mark 12, 14 through 17, the chief scribes, the Sadducees and the Pharisees, they are very clever, and with sugar-coated tongues, they said, "Teacher, Jesus, we know that you are sincere and show deference to no one. For you do not regard people with partiality, but teach the way of God in accordance with truth. Therefore, tell us, is it lawful to pay taxes to the emperor or not? Should we pay them or should we not?" But knowing their hypocrisy, he said to them, "Why are you putting me to the test? Bring me a denarius and let me see it." And they brought one. Then he said to them, "Whose head is this, and whose title?" They answered, "The emperor's, Caesar's." Jesus said to them, "Give to the emperor the things that are the emperor's, and to God the things that are God's. Give to the Caesar the things that are the Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." And they were utterly amazed at him. So you have to understand in this context, the Jewish Pharisees and Sadducees were always testing Jesus in public, with his disciples around him to discredit him, and with crowds around so that people could see that he would say the wrong thing. And this was a trick, because the emperor saw himself as God, and the Jews by this time were perceiving themselves as a monotheistic religion, that you should only give honor and tithe the temple, tithe God. So is it lawful in Jewish law and the Jewish religion to pay taxes to the emperor and not to the Jewish temple, to God? I mean, the money really went to the Pharisees and the Sadducees, right? But are you going to tithe God, or are you going to tithe the emperor who thinks he's God? And of course, this was a trick question again. They were setting Jesus up so that he could not possibly win. Because not only was it against the Jewish religion and tithing God instead of tithing the emperor, you have to understand that Jewish people did not like being heavily taxed by the Romans. One of the worst jobs you can have was to be a Roman tax collector. You were seen as a traitor of the Jews. The Jews realized that they had to kind of fall in step with the Roman governance because they saw historically what happened when they fought back against oppressors. They were usually murdered and put into slavery. But the Romans did allow the Jews to continue to do their own religion and to live by their own rules within their communities, religiously speaking, as long as they followed the Roman laws too and paid their taxes. So these taxes were heavy, and the Jewish people, of course, did not want to pay taxes, religiously speaking or politically speaking, to the Romans. So if Jesus said, yeah, you have to pay your taxes to the emperor, they would think that he was also in line with the Roman governance, which would make people reject him because the people did not like the Caesar or the Roman governance, taking their money, oppressing them, controlling them, taking away their liberties. However, Jesus would also be screwed, hypothetically thinking, if he said, don't pay the emperor. Because the next thing that they would do, once the Jewish priesthood heard that, they would tell King Herod, who was the king of the Jews, only put in place by the Romans. And then King Herod would tell Pontius Pilate. Pontius Pilate would then tell Julius Caesar. The emperor. And then what do you think would happen to Jesus if such an influential man made many people in the Jewish population stop paying their taxes? They would arrest Jesus and kill him. So if Jesus said, don't pay your taxes to the emperor, they knew they could get him arrested and probably executed for that. And if he said, oh, you need to pay the emperor, then they would think that Jesus was in bed with the Romans and was a detractor against Jewish faith and Jewish way of living. Jesus said, give me a denarius, which is a coin. To the left is actually a historically found denarius from Rome with the head of the Caesar on it, the head of the emperor on it. So they brought him a denarius, and Jesus said to them, whose head is this, and whose title? And they, the temple establishment, answered, the emperor's. Jesus said to them, give to the emperor the things that are the emperor's, and to God the things that are God's. And this zipped up their lips, and they couldn't say anything else, because it was a clever answer. Give to the emperor the things of the emperor so that there's no troubles, no bloodshed, no arrests, no riots, and give to God the things that are God's. They could not answer anything to that. They lost. They were utterly defeated by Jesus' words. So, what kind of bodies does one experience the resurrection in? This is another example of specifically the sect of the Sadducees. The Sadducees were trying to trick Jesus into refuting the doctrine of resurrection. The Sadducees ran the Second Temple, and when the Second Temple was destroyed in 70 AD, the sect of the Sadducees ceased to exist. They no longer existed after 70 AD. They just disappeared. And the Pharisees reorganized themselves into rabbinical Judaism after 70 AD. So in Mark 12, 18 through 27, it says, some Sadducees who say there is no resurrection came to him and asked him a question, saying, Teacher, Moses wrote for us that if a man's brother dies, leaving a wife but no child, the man shall marry the widow and raise up children for his brother. There were 7 brothers. The first married, and when he died, left no children. And the second married the widow and died, leaving no children. And the third likewise. None of the 7 left children. Last of all, the woman herself died. In the resurrection, whose wife will she be? For the 7 had married her. Jesus said to them, the Sadducees, is not this the reason you are wrong? That you know neither the Scriptures nor the power of God. For when they rise from the dead, when souls are resurrected, they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels in heaven. And as for the dead being raised, have you not read in the book of Moses, in the story about the bush, how God said to him, I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob? He is God not of the dead, but of the living. You are quite wrong. So the Sadducees are trying to trick Jesus into giving a wrong interpretation about resurrection. The idea of what they're teaching here, in case you're not familiar with Judaism, which many Christians are not, Moses wrote for us that if a man's brother dies, leaving a wife with no children, then the man's brother can marry the wife and inseminate her, essentially, so that she can have a child, so that the family lineage can continue and not end. But here, 7 brothers died exclusively without producing progeny in the woman, without continuing the family lineage, and then she died. So the Sadducees say, so in the resurrection, the afterlife, whose wife will she be? Because she married 7 men. And Jesus said to them, for when they rise, when they are resurrected from the dead, they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels in heaven. So this tells us 2 very important things. Angels do not have physical bodies. So number 1, right here, Jesus solidly refutes the idea that we rise in a physical body. Many Jewish sects, based on the teachings of Ezekiel, believe that when we die, you're buried, and at the time of resurrection, your bones will magically rise from the ground, be covered with sinews, muscle, blood, skin, etc., and you'll be revivified in the physical body. But here Jesus is teaching something quite different. He's saying that when the dead are resurrected, they will be like angels in heaven. And the first point to take from this is that angels do not have physical bodies. They have spiritual bodies. They have heavenly bodies, but they do not have physical bodies. So Jesus here is teaching that resurrection is not some kind of zombie apocalypse, but that when you die, a spiritual body rises from that flesh and has experiences in afterlife realities. That's one eye-opening teaching of Jesus that no priest or minister teaches. Either they don't understand it or they're covering it up. I don't mean to be disrespectful. My maternal grandmother, my grandma Mary, was one of the most special people in my life. She died in 1987 and was buried. There's not even dust in her grave anymore. What can be physically resurrected? Nothing. Not to be disrespectful to Jewish people or Christians that believe this, but it's just not logical to me. I know somebody can say that nothing is impossible for God, but God will not work against the laws of nature either. And my master is the Master Jesus. And he says quite clearly that in the resurrection, the dead will be like angels. That means they will have a spiritual body, not a physical body. The second part that's not taught, that's very interesting, that comes to me through the teachings of Apostolic Succession. When they rise from the dead, they will neither marry, nor are they given in marriage, but are like angels in heaven. Angels are androgynous. Angels are described as androgynous in extant Jewish and Christian speculation. So if your spiritual body is androgynous, meaning not male and not female, that means there's no need for marrying, because you're not male or female. Traditionally speaking, marriage was for males and females. Traditionally speaking. If you're neither male nor female, there's no marriage, there's no need for marriage, because man and woman can't come together in the afterlife, because their resurrection bodies, their spiritual bodies, their heavenly bodies are neither male nor female, but like angels, androgynous. The Sadducees did not believe in resurrection of any form, physical or spiritual. It didn't seem that they believed in heaven. And a lot of ancient religions, though it sounds weird, were the same way. A lot of ancient Mediterranean religions and Middle Eastern religions that existed at this time, they weren't concerned about an afterlife, which seems very weird to modern religious thinking. Because Christianity and even Judaism nowadays, and Islam and many sects of Hinduism and Buddhism, they all expect to go somewhere after death. And they all want to go somewhere good, not somewhere bad. But in ancient antiquity, including Judaism, which is quite an ancient religion, they worshiped God to have a good life, to prevent natural disasters, to have enough food, to have shelter, to have children, to produce progeny to continue the family lineage, as is spoken about in these verses. So the Sadducees seem to be like that. They were worried about what happened now in life. We worship God in the temple so that we have a good life. And it doesn't seem like they had much concern about an afterlife. And they didn't believe that there was a resurrection. They didn't believe that when you died, you rose in a spiritual body or any other kind of body to experience afterlife realities. And Jesus in the last verse is very clever. He said, well, don't you remember what Moses said at the burning bush? I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. He is not God of dead, rotting bodies in the ground, but of living spiritual beings. He's the God not only of our souls while we're in these physical bodies, but he's also the God of our living soul that experiences itself in a spiritual body, a heavenly body, a glorious body, like the angels after death. But it's also very important to note here that humans do not become angels. I've said this in other talks. Angels are a separate creation from humanity. Angels are a separate creation from humanity. Angels can come to heaven and appear as humans, but they're not actually humans. So in some stories in the Bible, and also in some romantic stories throughout time, you'll hear that, you might entertain an angel unaware. So be careful when somebody knocks on your door and asks for bread or asks for food or for some kind of support, because if you turn them away, it might be a test of an angel. It's not that the angel is a human being, it's that they are appearing. They have the ability to appear in the form of a human. And a lot of people, when their parents or a loved one dies, they say, oh, he or she is an angel in heaven. That's not true. Dead human beings do not become angels. Humans are a separate creation from angels. They are very distinct topics, very distinct categories. So we should understand that Jesus is saying they're like angels. It's not that they become angels. It's like they're angels for two reasons. When you die, you experience the resurrection. And that resurrection body is a spiritual body, a non-physical, heavenly, glorious, spiritual body. And that it is androgynous. It is neither male nor female. Let us continue with the Liturgy of the Chalice.